talofa lava and welcome everyone to our afternoon session. We are very excited about our next talanoa and our panel. We have some wonderful movers and shakers for you, and we're going to be celebrating World Social Work Day Pacific Styles with our wonderful panel, and the focus for this panel is enacting anti-racism within Aotearoa New Zealand social work systems. I am very, very pleased to welcome our panellists to you. So first we have Tu'u Apulu Mary Autagavaia. Mary is a social work educator, a policy maker, a change maker across Pacific communities within government departments. She is truly an innovator and a knowledge keeper and has used her knowledge and expertise to advance Pacific communities, adult education and Pacific social work. There is so much that Tu'u Autagavaia has been involved in, and it's difficult to note all of those impressive contributions, but I'm going to note a few. Tu'u has been a Samoan-specific facilitator of the Ngā Waka o Kāinga Tapu Samoan Family Violence Training Program. She's a cultural consultant, not only to government and social services in terms of social work and policy, language development, but also in terms of film, which is amazing, I think. A founder and leader facilitator for the Anga Nu'u Samoa program in adult and community education, focusing on Samoan language. Been involved in Samoan parenting programs, and is a social work educator and developer of Pacific social work supervision frameworks. And I can remember the first time I ever saw you was actually at a conference where you were presenting Pacific supervision frameworks. So how lucky are we to have you here? Next, I welcome Dr. Jean Mitaera. Jean is a social worker, researcher, educator, and policy advisor. She has taught at Victoria University and at Whitirea, New Zealand, where she was the social work lead of that program. She is the chief advisor of Pacific Strategy for Whitirea and WELTEC. She's a researcher for Aotearoa and has key involvement in Pacific research and education. Jean was one of the champions really for leading the development of the Cook Islands conceptual framework for transforming family violence. She's a board member of Taimanino Trust, a leading Pacific social service and health provider in Porirua. And Jean, you became famous in my eyes because I kept hearing about you before I ever met you. And had heard about the wonderful work that you had done. So it is great to have you here on our panel today. And then we turn to our tāne, William Pua. William is a social worker who leads a team of social workers at Fonua Ola. He's been a member of the Social Workers Registration Board and has led really innovative work with youth in the Pacific community. He's a co-developer of Mana Moana practice in the field of social work and community development and education, which is about enabling Pacific wisdom to inform and guide practice. And William, I remember meeting you years ago when you were doing innovative work, connecting art, music and social work practice in the empowerment of young people. So it is wonderful to have you on our panel today. So welcome to all of you. So in terms of celebrating Pacific social work, I think we can't get away from the fact that as well as talking about individual practice with individuals and families and communities, we need to also talk about our our need to enact anti-racism work. And that's the topic of our panel today. So to start with, what I'd like to do is invite each of you to introduce yourselves and talk about your social work practice with Pacific and your work in the area of anti-racism. So I am going to pass over to Tu'u to begin with.
Tan falava malo se fo manuia o e fai ona fa fo mai pa fe wa it's for the so at sai Yvonne but for ya Tracy malo lele ya marato o lango matalo fa tu so Jean lu so ya oi kia ora pa pe fo tonga ne ya William ya ai ya le tu nei tu la o mai tato fa na o le tu. Just greetings, warm Pacific greetings and acknowledgement. The reason why we go around and name specific people and what the different roles is because it comes back to that idea that should be equivalent in Pacific social work is that everything's related. That by acknowledging people individually, it also makes it inclusive. So. We are the inclusive supreme just by, even the way that we start our formulas and our talanoa, that it's important that they reach out and do that specifically with each of you in our own specific languages, I suppose. But just the question's been asked about just a little bit about myself. You were very kind and generous, Yvonne, in your introduction, very generous. It's very humbling, but I'm basically a mum of 5 adult children and we have 7 grandchildren. We live in Auckland. I'm Samoan born. Came here when I was very young with my parents and that's when the flights went through Pangu and we landed up and then over the shore. That's where our flight landed. That's how long ago it was. But, all those journeys as migrants and children of migrants and are some of the things that compels me and motivates me when I think back about the journeys of my parents and what it took for them to survive and thrive in this country. Now I have children and grandchildren who are carrying their, there's a proverb in Samoa that talks about when we finish building the canoe, then the whole community gets around the canoe and we each take to each part of the community as a part of the canoe that they sand. And so all of us have been sanding that canoe or that va'a since the migration of our parents. And so when I started social work in 1981, it was called the Department of Social Welfare back then. And the social work had just come away from the Ministry of Education or the Education Board as we know it then. And it was the era of the Aotearoa report, guys like John Mitaera and others. And so it was, I started my social work career at a point where Māori people were actually confronting the racism and calling it out. And, the project of Aotearoa and what it's become nowadays signifies to me that, those battles against racism when I think back about those things. So I just want to acknowledge all that work that was done back then, particularly by our Māori people in calling out racism for what it was. So I did social work there in the Department of Social Welfare in Māngere. At the time, there were only 2 Samoan social workers and there weren't many Pacific people at all as practitioners throughout the country. And so we then began to develop a network, what we called like a Pacific Island network across the country. And that's where I met William and Jean and, others that every now and then we'd fund ourselves to fly to Wellington and, I myself did structural analysis training. It was a time of networking. It was a time to regenerate ourselves in the midst of all the racism that was going on around us. It was also the time of the Bastion Point, just after Bastion Point and just after the Springbok tour. So I guess for me, my social work practice was, those were the seeds of it planted around that time. As well, I lived in a community, I still live in South Auckland, where we saw racism all the time, from the early dawn raids. My family home was raided in the early morning several times for relatives that my parents had brought from Samoa. We saw evidence of that around us, and I guess I took that into my social work practice and actively it was always in the back of my mind when I was out doing social work. Often when we were uplifting children at the time under the Department of Social Welfare, it was, it just didn't sit right with me for those reasons of racism, And I always remember my father saying to me, even a bad mum is better than no mum. And I always remember that because, when we think about what's happening today, when children are removed from their aingas, their kāinga, the opportunity, we miss that opportunity for parents to thrive and grow for various different reasons. From there, I went to across to the Teachers Training College. I was a regional trainer for the Department of Social Welfare, and then I crossed over to Auckland College of Education, and I taught in the social work course for about 10, 12 years. So at the time, probably 80% of the social work professionals went through there. And I had a lot to do with the Pacific Island social workers. And again, I saw from there the racism within education and academia itself, and the struggle to get more workers onto the floor, really. Getting them through the program, helping them understand the program, helping them understand and make sense of what was a natural, intuitive thing for us as Pacific people to do, which is fesosoani, which is to help. And I've never been comfortable with the idea that of the term social work, because it doesn't describe in Pacific eyes what we actually do. And that is to tautua, that is to be aoona. So tautua means to serve, to be a servant. From there, I went to Samoa, and I taught at the National University in Samoa at the Teachers Training College. But at the same time, there was a lot of things happening in Samoa around social work practice. And so, I continued to do social work from Samoa, which was, albeit very, so I used to receive young people who had failed, whose families had wanted them out of the New Zealand system, got into trouble, and were wanting to send their children back home. And so I picked up some of that social work practice back home and helping that children who had been removed from New Zealand assimilate back into Samoa, and then later on help them back here if that was the case. From Samoa, I did quite a bit of work in the Pacific, across Fiji, and for UNDP and for UNICEF. I was part of a team that looked at identifying the prevalence of child abuse in Samoa throughout, and we did research in 30 different villages, 20 in Apulu and 10 in Sawai. And then that document went on to do to other policy makers in Samoa. And then in 2012, I think, 2019, there was a piece of work that came out of Samoa from the ombudsman that confronted child abuse, and based off some of that work that we've done back then. And so I've been back in New Zealand for a while, and that's when I met up with William again, and we did some work that he was leading with youth, and I went across and did a little bit of work to support the work that William was doing. Since then, shortly after that, I started a Samoan language and culture program, because I thought that the basis of social work and our personhood is really knowing who you are culturally. And culture, my stance has always been that culture is the therapy. is therapeutic. Knowing who we are is therapeutic in itself. And I always think about that, the verse in the Bible, healer, heal yourself first. In other words, as social work practitioners, we needed to explore those issues of identity within ourselves before we can work with others. And so that program's been going for quite some time now. It's now called Oawa Samoan. We do quite a bit of work in Wellington, come across to Wellington, but we've also been in Australia, all over Australia, America, Hawaii. And before COVID, we were due to go up to Alaska. So that work is, I must say, it's probably one of the most rewarding and fulfilling pieces of work that I've been involved in. And at the moment, because of COVID, we're grounded, and so I've been working, developing a Samoan parenting program that runs in Mangere East, one of our very poor areas in South Auckland. And it's called Soalaupule. The word Soalaupule means to share your power. It's power sharing. And so the course is about exploring who we are and exploring how we were raised and the things that to reflect on the things that we do now and how we behave as parents. And that's kind of the major pieces of work that I'm doing at the moment. But in terms of racism, since moving out of government practice and more and working in the community, you can't help but see and I must say that our specific social workers are sometimes very racist to our own people, and I've sat in FGCs and family group conferences where I am appalled at some of the things. I sat in a FGC just last Friday, a 7-hour FGC. It was a non-Pacific social worker on the other end and her team, but right at the end of the family plan, they suggest that the parents should undergo a neuropsychological assessment. I'm thinking, the hell, are we back to Darwinism now? Are we? What has that got to do with parenting? Sadly, racism is alive and well in Aotearoa. And in terms of the way that we practice, I'd like to think it wasn't around, but the structural racism and then the acceptance by us specific social workers of some of those practices and the policies of our organisation just, blows my mind. It just blows my mind. That's it from me, Yvonne.
Oh, whawhataitere lava, that was fantastic. In fact, a number of points you raised really made me think carefully about how much context influences our social work journey, and thinking about the 80s and that time of the fight from our tangata whenua and how that has impacted our journey, and how the knowledge that you gained from then and the context then has influenced your social work journey as well. Thank you so much for that. Now we're going to move to Jean. So Jean, if you could share a little bit of your experience, please.
Kia ora an tātou katoa I te awatea. Te karangani te irawaku. I nāo ki te meita ki te mataora kia no katoa te o taia ke ma te tau te kai. I'm quoting the Psalms. I wish my minister was watching because he'll die hearing me quoting the Psalms. How good and how pleasant it is for God's people to dwell together in harmony. It's really wonderful to be part of a forum where Pacific social workers gather and hear each other's voice. Like Tu'u, Yvonne has elevated me beyond reality. I'm Cook Island Māori, born and bred out of Newtown, Wellington. So all things, the mecca of all things for this part of the country. And in terms of family, my highest title is mummy. And when a son is broken, then it's banker. So that's really my familial and most professional place. Most of my practice has been in education, social work education, and research, not with clients. And so I've done education, social work, and health research. And so right now I'm part of 2 HRC projects. And one of them is quite, I suppose, meaningful to me, which looks at the Cook Islands chronic kidney disease. Cook Islanders with chronic kidney disease. So, so that's where I really cut my cloth, is in the research and education area. I've written 3 curricula for social work. And I think my last statement in terms of curriculum was to make sure that Te Reo Māori was part of the curriculum and Pacific protocols and practices was part of the curriculum. And I hadn't, so even though we talk about things Māori, talk about things Pacific and social work settings, I had not seen it in curriculum. And so for me, that is one of the key influences that I think I have been interested to participate in, is how do you influence curriculum that actually educates social workers. The second area is research, and then how do you influence methodological approaches so that you expand people's sphere of doing and how to do, has been really important. I still teach from time to time. My current role, which is an interesting one, I think my mother, if she was still alive, would be absolutely fascinated that the Bachelor of Nursing Pacific sits under me. I have frequent flyer points as a patient rather than a health professional. But, you know, we, over time, our focus adjusts. It doesn't really change, it just adjusts. And so I have a 3-part portfolio as Chief Advisor. One is Pacific Nursing, one is research, and the other is pastoral care of learners. And so that's funny, it's a circle back into social work, that I have 2 teams who do the follow-up with Pacific learners across the 2 campuses, 3 campuses, actually. I think that's pretty much it. When Tua was talking, I thought, yeah, I walked and protested the Springbok tour outside Parliament and saw the batons coming down. I remember visiting my cousin, who was a police officer at the time at Bastion Point, and just all the challenges he received as a brown cop from his brown relatives and community people, because he was one of the cops at the front line. And so those things rang true. The staff who taught me at Victoria University were mostly Tūhoe. So John Rangiho was there, everything was John Rangiho. So, and quite rightly at that time, because that was a turning point. The report that came out was a turning point for New Zealand social work to actually own a New Zealand, sort of put a line in the sand. Just been very fortunate to write at different times with some good people around cultural competencies, a cultural humility framework, especially in social work and education. And then, of course, more recently, a community role with Te Ao Manino Trust. Kia ora and everyone, really pleased to be here.
Oh, so tele lava, Dr. Jean. It's great to hear. Actually, you mention education and curriculum, and that is, of course, on that continuum of we also need to think about what we're doing in an anti-racist way with our curriculum. Thank you for your sharing there. And now, William, it's over to you.
It's good to go last. One, because you feel totally intimidated. I realised I should have said yes to first. Talofa lava, my name is William Pua. It's such an honour to be here. Thank you to Tracy and to Yvonne, and also to Mary and Jean and things. I knew I won the lottery when I ended up with these 2 over here. But I've been thinking about that term, the anti-racist. I've just, my background in social work is around social work education, working in NGO, you know, and also now coming into a Pacific NGO, working for a mainstream, we'll call it mainstream NGO. and also a brief stint in social work in schools. But and I think that I've always been wrestling around that word of anti-racism, because it's just so much of our life, so much of our existence and being, that in a sense, does it really speak to maybe our diversity and our right to be as Indigenous people, to be able to talk to our world and take the centre stage and place our values and our beliefs at the core of our world as we see our problems and our issues. But I think the anti-racism part comes in to the fact that we have to be able to study and contest the world through other people's eyes, through our Western education, be able to understand not only who we are in that space, but also who we are in that academic space, to that practice space, the lack of Māori Pacific leadership and supervision, to be able to build who we are when our courses of social work don't readily prepare us for our own communities. So I think the notion of anti-racism, maybe some years ago, I would have nicely carried that placard, but maybe it's just getting older. Maybe that placard's getting too heavy, and maybe it's more the emergence of, it is about our diversity and our right to be, to find our own voice so that we can speak clearly, articulate our needs. But it is a wrestle and challenge, and tensions exist for us to be able to gain control of the resources and what we need, the resources and everything that we need to be able to look after ourselves and things, and I'm just thinking of the family harm space, of which I'm spending a lot of time in, is the reflection that, it's like 80% of Pacific people are dealt with by mainstream organizations and all that. So how do we ever have the hope as Pacific organizations be able to develop when the majority of the resources going elsewhere? So in terms of anti-racism and in terms of our field, I think maybe there is a reframing that's needed around our positioning. And I think that maybe anti-racist might be the wonderful terms that Palangis will have to use to position themselves, and maybe our voices about our indigeneity might be the voice that we speak with. So glad to be here for this lovely, lovely talanoa.
Thank you, William. I think what you've done is actually led beautifully, thank you, into the next question for our panelists. And I'm not sure, William, if you want to go first or second this time. Just trying to share the first position around. But I guess the question is, so how do we counteract like personal racism when we come across it, or structural racism, or even if racism is the word? Do you have some tips and ideas for people about how we can work against racism and perhaps actually reframe our positioning, as you suggest, William, and actually find our voice? How do we promote that?
I've been thinking about this a lot, the idea that we do need not so much a Bachelor of Social Work, but a Bachelor of Me, where we are at the core of our studies, the understanding, like the points that Tu'u raised earlier, around knowing who we are in that space. How has life informed who we are? What are the maps that we have collected in our upbringing, in our cultural values, our beliefs, the context of our church? All these things have impacted on who we are and has informed us greatly about what we see, what we deem as important, what we deem as unimportant. And I think for Pasifika students going through mainstream studies, it is, how do we make sense that in the othering, we need to find ourselves? So, this is the challenge from my perspective for educators that sit in that space, is around you know, how are we able to broker a better understanding of who we are when we are forever othered, you know, and when we return, you know, as students back to our own communities, we then also look at our own communities through the eyes that we have trained in. So we have to make sense of that time out in the wilderness, in our training, in our Western education, and make sense of those things that are valued in our community that can guide and speak to the heart of our practice. And I think that's the transformative bit of who we are and what we need to address as specific, you know, is that we must know who we are, and we must be able, and as educators in that field, be able to understand how Western education impacts on us and how it takes us further away from our own community. And how do we make up for the 4 years that we've just spent in the wilderness, and be able to build that on the way through in terms of our practice when we don't have enough supervisors to help us grow that practice. So our training doesn't address it. Our supervision and our workspaces definitely don't provide enough Māori or Pacific supervisors to be able to guide the growing of this practice that you have to grow by yourself and in other spaces. Then, you know, what is it? You know, what is social work to us? But yeah, that's what I've been thinking about.
Thank you, William. Jean, can we turn to you now just to provide your sort of views about how we counteract racism or oppression, some of the things that William's talking about, but also that we experience on the ground in practice?
Yeah, my thinking's not too far off actually from William's. And so I want to borrow from Tūranga Māori, which is the Cook Islands family violence framework. In Tūranga Māori talks to us about our tūranga, our position, place and status. So we, all of us, have personal, professional and community tūranga. And that's really important, that they don't necessarily all play at the same time, that we have to have the skills to understand what this context is and which of my tūranga is being played out. So that's the first thing, which is to actually know yourself and your tūranga given the context. Every tūranga needs relationships. So in Cook Island Māori, the term is pirianga. And so as a social worker, as a Pacific social worker, you can't be an island on your own and then just think that, you know, you're going to be able to survive. If the networks don't come to you, then you must go and create those relationships. You must go to your Pacific colleagues. You can go to a whole range of other colleagues as well, but you must go to find a family of support and relationships for your tūranga. You can't just sit there by yourself. And so if you don't have the formal supervision relationships, you have collegial relationships. And so the earlier session with Joe, with Tō Pepe, and with help me, Yvonne, with Judy, with the practitioners, really highlights that in their own right, they are not only confident in their practice, but have a knowing of the practice capacity in their communities. And that's what's really important, I think, in terms of meeting, challenging and responding to racism, is that you understand your tūranga and you come with relationships that will not only shoulder with you the impact, but also help you walk through. The last thing is that every tūranga, personal, professional and community, has duties of care, and they are not the same. They are not the same. So there are different settings, and it could be a social work forum like this. And I decided that actually I have this tūranga with Mary. We have our knowing of each other have interconnected it several times over the last 30 years. Some of the people on this forum are not even 30 years old, Mary. Oh my gosh. But you know, so there are times when I will practice as if I am a family member, even though we are not blood family. But there are times when it's really important for us to practice as sisters. And it's my job as one of those sisters to acknowledge the seniority of Mary, and as a consequence of that tūranga, then how we will do and connect with each other given the context, especially when there are other people. There will be times that we will draw on our community tūranga. And I know it's William sitting here, but of course I always think of Mua Pua, who I spent most of my time in the 90s having unusual exchange of words, especially when he was wearing his pink collar with the tapa designs and reading out his poetry. And I always, so they are PIC Newton, their upbringing in PIC Newtown. And so we used to, we friendly banter, but I tell you what, you could not ask for a stronger brother or colleague, depending on the context. So that's my way. How do you deal with racism? How do you push back and be safe? You stand on your tūranga. You must understand who you are and what you are. You stand with your relationships, your pirianga, and always you must understand what is your duty of care in this context. So as Pacific social workers, our duty of care is servants to our clients, but there are times when we have other types of relationships with our clients. We must never forget that we are not the all-knowing social workers. There are times when we are their juniors. We are their apprentices, but we just happen to be here and we know the systems and the processes, and our job is to help facilitate. We are seldom their seniors. And when we are, we must do it with generosity. I think that's one way that we can deal with. And it doesn't mean that you are the one person in the one wrong every time. You have many wrongs.
Thank you, Jean. So now I want to pass over to you in terms of what your thinking is about how we can counteract this racism. And I was really interested to hear that you say that experience of sometimes our Pacific social workers are caught up in that and actually acting in a way or practicing in a way that is that seems racist. So wondering if you can respond to that, please.
I totally concur with what's been said by both William and Jean. I think after people have done a 4-year degree, the degree is because what social work training does is that it takes us out of our Indigenous state of knowing, our Indigenous state of relationships, or tūranga, our pi'iranga, as Jean has said. And it puts us into a world where for 4 years we're bombarded with white is right, which is, what our nations, our Pacific nations have endured and saw in the 1830s with colonization, And so we come, I think we come out even less familiar with ourselves, and we take those things and then we work those on our own community. And it's really sad. So I think it's, I don't know what who the proper body is, but to run some sort of workshops, like I said, back in the 90s, 80s, 90s, Jean and some of us, and in fact all three of us on this panel, were part of a network, a Pacific network, where we just kind of got together, and often it was hosted in Wellington, and we kind of had this training, if you know what I mean. It was like, what's the word? We were trying to teach ourselves our way back, and that way back to who we were was really addressing the structural racism. But it started with us as individuals, and we discovered so many things about ourselves. Some of it we didn't like, but it became the basis of who we were. I think, who we were, certainly who I am now and how I practice. And so there has to be some body, some, ANZSW, I don't know, Pacific, caucus in there that puts its hands up and says, hey, we're going to run a Pacific Island network and we're going to have these workshops once a quarter or something, But the training has to be really, really carefully thought out, and it has to be, the idea of Indigenous is like, Samoans back home, they hate the word Indigenous because Samoans equate Indigenous to only people that have lost their land. And what they're saying is that we are Indigenous, so for them, when they speak as Samoans, they're speaking as Indigenous people. And I think we have to reclaim that spot for ourselves. I think that's what William was trying part of what William was trying to say is that we have to reclaim that Pacific Indigenous for ourselves. Even the word Pacific is colonial in itself, And so, our Cook Island, our Fijian, our Samoan, our Tongan, And we see a really good model in the kainga, what is it? In the Ngāwaka program, yeah. So we've got programs that are written by the Pacific nations themselves, And it's kind of like that stuff, but really, I think that as the generations go on, in the absence of anything that motivates us to seek change or demand change, we have to claim that change for ourselves. And the starting point has to be acknowledged, has to start with each and every one of us acknowledging that we could do better in our practice. And coming out of that then is to have some sort of forum where some really good training is done around racism. And I too don't like the idea of anti-racism practice. I think there's a term that the Palangis, it more applies to the Palangis. But we need to talk about Cook Island Indigenous, Tongan Indigenous, and claim that space for ourselves. Otherwise, we just get mucked around. You see, our relationships with Māori are pre-treaty. So I don't have an issue around, is it good enough for us or good enough for Māori? Our piitanga or our relationship with Māori is the pre-treaty. Does that make sense? And so it's that model of, you Palangis, you go sort out those things. We need to sort out our space. I was also thinking about that idea that in that training, it's really about training, knowing yourself. Who are you? I mean, I was doing cultural supervision for a certain organisation, and they identified 3 staff members, all Samoan. 2 of the staff members, were really good. We did heaps of it. But one staff member kept coming to me and said, right from get-go, was like this, I'm not doing this. I'm not, I don't need this. Oh, why is that? I don't believe, I need to know this stuff. My family don't practice it, blah, blah, blah. My family are not, I'm Samoan and she looks Samoan. But I'm not practicing it. It's got no relevance to me. So that whole thing of trauma in our own lives, we talk about our clients experiencing trauma and manifesting trauma. Like, heal yourself first. Hey, the traumas in our own life. And, and that's at the bottom of this, our own personal experiences within our culture. But I think overarching for me in terms of that, our ancestors, like I said, we came at a time as migrants, and that journey really formed my experience and who I am now. When my kids play up and they say, oh, I don't want to do that, I'll say to them, are you telling me my parents wasted time coming here? And tying everything back to that migration and our ancestors before that. And I think once we find that place, because at the moment, training is kind of like out there, we're worshipping dead theorists, but our own ancestors are calling on us, and they help us to unlock some of those keys. For example, when I look at the Samoan model of practice, one of the pieces of work that I want to put out there is just even the whale, the way that Samoan whales are set out on a quarter-acre space where the ainga lives. We've got the front house is the matai's house, or le whaletele, the houses behind that, the whaleo'o and the whaletua, that's where the families live. And then behind that, you've got the whalelua, the light cooking spaces. Then you've got the umu. Then you've got the whaleese, and then you've got the maumanga. All of that is something that our ancestors, what is that? How do we use that in social work? Hey, that there's an order to it, that it's autua, the maumanga, the plantation services, the umu services, the household service, the whaletele. And then the other side of that is the tausi, the duty of care that Jean's talking about. And there's a model in itself there, and it's something our ancestors have left for us. How does that work? And then look at how that then works for us here in New Zealand. Okay, we don't have maumanga, we don't have plantation, but we've got jobs, or we should have jobs, because without jobs, our kitchen isn't, our pantries don't fill, and so on and so on and so on. And remembering that our ancestors also left enough space for us to grow in there, that it's not static, that you don't just be a tautua or a young person all your life. At some stage, you're going to move up to the front of the house, and what are the skills that you need to. So I guess, just as an example, we've got so much content in our own indigeneity that we should be, that's what we need to be training our social workers with, so that they are confident in themselves, and also helping them to deal with their own trauma, because I think there's a lot of that for many of us, There's a lot of, around our culture. I mean, in the work that we do around anganua all over the world, that's the thing I hear from everyone. My parents never wanted to speak Samoan. They never wanted us to grow up like Samoans. They wanted us to get a Palangi education, and it's dealing with that and exploring that, and so that because that's what we bring into our social work practice. It's that trauma with that. But I think that there's a Samoan idea about tamali anga. Tamali anga is our, I don't know the Palangi word for it, but the Samoans believe that everyone has tamali anga. We're born with it, and it manifests itself in our actions and our beliefs. And so sometimes that tamali anga, is displaced. We take on a different tamali anga when we go to work. But and we leave behind the spirit, for want of a better word, that is indigenous to us, but we take on another spirit, and it's going back to that original tamali anga, because that tamali anga is based on alofa, twa oi, as Jean's alluded to, our relationships, and how we deal with people. But I think for me, we're still following that white is right, and that's enforced by the policies of our agencies, the law that we practice under, but it's finding our way back to who we are.
Thank you, Tu'u. You've all raised some wonderful points that have actually responded to a range of questions that I had in place. So thank you so much for doing that. I think what we might do, just being aware of the time, and there's some really, I think, important questions that people are asking. So if you're okay with that, we'll turn to the questions. And I wanted to ask, the first one is about challenging and confronting racism. And how do you call out instances where we as Pacifica perpetuate the structural racism? Jean, I might go to you first this time. So how do we call out our own people when we see them enacting or supporting structural racism?
I'll just give an example. I didn't do preschool education. I stayed at home as a preschooler with my mum because she was a night worker, and that was it. I just stayed at home while she slept, and I got some pictures. So I was really surprised some 25, 30 years later when a child of our family came home, and another child said something, and this child responded, "Stop, I don't like it." And I thought, wow, that's really powerful what this 4-year-old learned from preschool, that the 4-year-old could articulate what I think I might not have been able to articulate so directly. Stop. I don't like it. I thought, what a wonderful teacher that this child who was being annoyed by another could just stand their ground and say it. That's essentially what we need to do. And I think that the niceties about most Pacific practices is that we will give an example. We won't say it straight out. We will provide a context. We will go around and we will demonstrate and put the situation on ourselves in order to serve a learning. It's just that when we do that, we can't be sure that our colleague who we want to call out is actually clicked, because they might not actually have the same cultural knowledge or context as you. Your socialization and your knowledge of community might not be their reality. And so one of the things is, I think we go back to the beginning of this panel, is the surety of you to know yourself, to have some confidence in yourself, and to actually know your strengths, as opposed to being worried about your weaknesses. Know your strengths and stick to your lane and talk to the things that you are confident in, and be able to say, like the 4-year-old, stop. This is not appropriate. Stop. This is not okay. Stop. You're forgotten. We are very conscious that we don't call out someone in a public setting, because we need to save their dignity and the dignity of the occasion. So our stopping might not be outright stop. And sometimes we have the ability, which is about the strength of facilitation and the ability of knowing how to read an occasion, to interject without it being rude. What's the lesson for me in this is that we can call out when we are skilled and have a confidence in our own knowing. It's easier to call that out as opposed to call out and you've got nothing to back your calling out. I think, I'm very conscious it's me saying this. For someone like me, size matters. Size and age matters. So I'm more likely to be able, I have a level of confidence to call out something, to stop something, and not break the dignity of the occasion or the person. But that's a learned skill. That's a learned skill that you pick up observing others. So I think that's the other thing about relationships. Relationships aren't just so that you've got some friends, but they create spaces where you're learning from each other how they did it, and then how you might do it the same or different. So how do you call it out? You call it out so you don't leave them without dignity. You do it in the most respectful way, but sometimes you cannot afford to let it go. Because if you let it go, you are often sanctioning the words or the action, and it will be repeated again to somebody else. So when you have that ability, or you sometimes you can look around the room. You know how we are. We look around the room when we don't like what we heard, and we look for who is the best person amongst us. Because if we're all looking around, we all felt it. And we will look around the room to summons support without talking. And I might look to Mary, and I'm just looking in. So she'll use her tūranga to interject, but to do it in a way that understands what's happening. Does that make sense? We don't want to do what white people do to us, and white people do to Māori. We don't want to do that, and we don't want to have to put our hand like we're a learner. No, we're a member. We're a member of this community. We're a member of this family. So this kind of business is rubbish. We don't want to move emotion because we don't want to exact the wrong on somebody else. But we want to be always in training so that we can read and understand where our voice is best placed so that we are able to call it out. That's my part A answer. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. It's actually, I was thinking about what Tu'u was saying in relation to what you were saying, Jean, is that, if we call things out in a way that is not appropriate to our Pacific cultures and who we are, we're actually it's like re-traumatizing that person who might be in that space. So yeah, we have to be really appropriate and know ourselves and who's best to do that.
And sometimes in a smaller circle, when it's just us, we can be very direct because we do it with love. We don't do it to make an example out of you. We do it to correct it before we go to a bigger forum. We do it to help prepare ourselves going forward. I'll leave.
Thank you. I just wondered if, William, did you want to jump in response to how do we, and add to the ideas about how we talk with others about, or particularly our Pacific people, with the racism they're enacting, knowing that racism might not be the right word.
Yeah, I think that I think it comes back to the right to be, and we need to be who we are in this space so that we can build our practice that recognises the needs of our families and whānau. And I'm thinking of the family harm space. And if we only deliver social work by contract, it's like social work by numbers. It doesn't actually enlist us or enable us to be everything we can be in that space. And I think that's the worry and the concern I had, not so much around the challenging of others. It's about how do we enact who we need to be. These families, these vulnerable women and children need us to be the best that we can be in that space, and to be able to be there for them, to be able to walk and journey with them, to bring our skills, the maps that we've come, and to lay it at their feet, so that they can consider the type of support that we can offer. So to me, it's not a question of if or when, it's the fact that we have to be the best that we can be in this space. Our families need us to be there. Our men need to understand, the hurt and the grief that they brought into their families, but also the hope and also the rightful role that they should be playing in our families. And I think that's the challenge. That's what's at stake. Whether we sit with the labels of anti-racist or whatever, it's the fact that we are an impoverished, vulnerable community with very complex factors that affect our living and breathing, with a pandemic sitting on top of us and everything. So who are we to be, in this storm? And I think that's the question we have to answer.
Thank you, William. Now, I'm going to pass over to you for the last word as we're heading towards 3 o'clock. We've had a number of people on the chat call for example, is it time for a Pacific social work qualification? You've talked about training, and you've also talked about how we everyone's talked about how we build and connect our relationships to work against some of those forces that are oppressing us, either personally or in our practice. Just wondering if you have any ideas to share about where we could go to from this caucus and symposium.
I think that there's a mechanism within most social work agencies for cultural supervision or external supervision that's not used, not used well. And I think that I know when I've listened to social workers bring issues that, that doesn't sit comfortably with them, but they don't quite know what to do with it. There needs to be a forum, whether it's through an external, and it needs to be an external, an external, person or body that can help our social workers, one, listen to what the issue is, to help them identify what are the issues here. Because when you go up against structural racism or personal racism, that's a bloody hard job. you know, it's a hard and scary thing. There's the prospect of losing your work, blah, 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 everything. But it's to have an external body or some sort that can, social workers, and whether they're statutory social workers or community social workers, can bring that issue to, and for someone to listen to them and go through that, I help identify what the issues are and what the process might be. And it's purely to support the Pasifika social workers, hey? And then help them to work out, okay, what's the plan here? But I think before that, it's about knowing what the issues are, so that there needs to be some work done around even identifying what those issues are. Because I think sometimes that we're so caught up in the policies and practices of our own organisations that we can't see through it, eh? And we become the transmitters of that in our communities and amongst our families. And so I'd love everyone, you know, I'd love to give some thought to that, about a body that can help our own practitioners sort through those issues and provide some support for them. So it'll be like, you know, to give them some guidance. The Samoan word for lele ole whaamawhanawhana is to comfort, eh? And so it's not just to embrace, but it's to, sometimes when, you know, if I've got an issue and I'd go to Jean, even just Jean just sit there and listen to me, hey, and then at the end help me draw out those issues, hey. At the end of it, the goal is to be mawhanawhana, to be warm, to be to feel that support, hey. Yeah, I think that what we don't have, you know, like we need to be more proactive. We need to be proactive about these things. I think for too long we've been talking about it, but we need to be proactive and start rallying to develop some of these things. I think about during COVID last year, some parts of my family were severely hit by COVID, and you know, and all of us were on the phone and were kind of freaking out about what was happening, particularly with the old people going into hospital. The ambulances weren't coming, you know, people, other family members were getting infected meantime. When they went into hospital, there was no translation, all those sort of things. So we talked about the issue, all of us, for 4 nights or something. We were Zooming in the issue, but we didn't know how to form a plan from there. Hey, so yeah, my job was to come in and try and develop a plan around that. And the solution was, we made a plan, okay, we're going to find a solution. We're not just going to, you know, we need to find a solution. The solution was to go to our own people in the health system and got them to come and Zoomed with us. And we laid our grievances with them, and then they escalated that up, and then they came back down with the solutions, eh? And it was a real, and I deliberately took our young people, our 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 18-year-olds on that journey with us, so that they can remember, you know, how we came to those solutions and how we were able to pull on our own people who had some power. And where we didn't have Pacific people, our own Pacific Health people then got those people, you know, Bloomfields, you know, all those people down to our level, to our Zoom, and listen to what we were saying. Hey. So it's about being proactive, being, and sometimes when Pacific, we get angry and we, you know, all that, but anger alone is good, but we need a solution as well, eh? So that we need, that anger is critical, because that's what should move us to change. But if we're experiencing racism all the time and we don't do anything about it, something's going to give. Hey, you know, we say, well, King Ali Ulu, I'm tired, and that's us giving up because it's too big. Whereas I think if we teach our people to how the steps might work and who whether it be the unions or, you know, whatever. But I believe we've come to a point in our existence in Aotearoa where we've got some semblance of a good workforce, not just as practitioners, but in different areas across mainstream organisations that we should be able to, interact with, so that we take those and we find a solution. We have a Samoan saying, "E fofo le ala mea le ala mea." So that crown of thorns that lives in the reef like a kina, it when you stand on one side of it, it injects poison into you, toxin into you. But if you flip the thing on itself and then put your foot back on it, it sucks its own poison out. So we can, even though that we might experience the discrimination, the hurt, the humiliation sometimes, the humiliation of being treated in such a way, but we can't put actions to it. We can put emotions to it and feelings, but I think the role of an external body is to provide then some plans and words to that.
Oh, whawhatautele lava. Some stirring words, and really appreciate the call to rally that you've all made for us at the symposium, and some excellent things for us to think about as we counteract oppressive structures, and some beautiful examples that you've each given from your own experience about how we can do that. Whawhatautele lava, thank you so much for sharing your words of wisdom with us. To Mary Autagavaia, Dr. Jean Mitaera and William Pua. Your words have been stirring and inspirational, and I hope that they lead us to some action in this space. Thank you so much for your contribution.